when a close-knit team of award-winning video game developers embarks on a boy's own adventure in the Canadian wilderness. What begins as a light-hearted investigation into an obscure local legend takes a somber turn when a dismembered body is discovered. In the ensuing days, their off-the-grid vacation devolves into a zero-sum game of predator and prey, played out against the backdrop of wild, uncharted forest, as the men are hunted down by a monstrous remnant from a savage, bygone epoch. Before we get into it, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when I upload a new video. Thanks. I'm Christian Bravery, and you are listening to Savage Bites. This is the horror of the Husker. It happened in the fall of 2014. What we discovered up there in that intractable wilderness of forested mountains changed my life and the lives of my friends and colleagues forever. What we were to find in those isolated woods was something none of us could have conceived of in our wildest flights of imagination, nor in our darkest nightmares. I can still see them when I close my eyes. I can still hear the screams. The medication that my doctors have prescribed helps me sleep, but nothing can erase the memories, and nothing can allay my fear of those monstrous beings whom, so far as I know, still haunt and slay and feed amid the boundless forests of the Canadian Northwest. It had been a tough year, finishing our fledgling company's first video game, Creature Catcher, and bringing it to market had pushed me and the rest of my team to the limit. What had felt like endless months of crunch, working 80-hour weeks, sometimes not leaving the office for days on end, had segued seamlessly into a grueling 6-week tour of pre-launch press events, all culminating in a big launch at a major industry event in Vancouver. I hated the limelight. I'm a nerd at heart, a creative type who just wants to be left alone to play in his little digital sandbox. The big stage and the bright lights and the pressure of all those eyes on me was anathema to my natural spirit, but it had to be done. The product was just one piece of the puzzle. Marketing hype was required to complete the picture of success. I knew that well enough, and so I played along. To my surprise, I found that I was actually quite good at public speaking. My awkward, self-deprecating style and acerbic wit came across surprisingly well with a crowd chiefly made up of like-minded introverts. The game launch went without a hitch, the game garnering a positive reception from industry pundits, influencers, and fans alike. All I could think about was getting away, getting out into nature, so I could breathe again. 2 days after the launch, we ghosted. Our little convoy was on the road driving north into the wild forested uplands of British Columbia. A ragtag bunch of geeks and nerds, boys only, friends I'd made during the course of my career at companies I'd worked at or met at industry events. There were even a couple of lads from my very first job in the industry, people I'd known for a decade or more. We were a tight-knit bunch, and this was our annual escape. This year, it was the turn of our British art director, Dan, to formulate plans for the after-show retreat. The object of our outbound expedition was known only to him, as was our destination. If you asked me to place it on a map now, I could not. Navigation was never a particular strong suit of mine, and besides, even if I did know, I wouldn't tell you. I have way too much spilt blood on my conscience already. There's no way I'm adding yours to my tally. It was north of Prince George, that's all I'll say. We stopped there for dinner, and our last night in a comfy motel bed before we headed up into the mountains. As those ancient wooded slopes grew up around us on our northward bound journey, I felt the stifling claustrophobia of the media circus melting away. The dense crowds, all those expectant eyes, the bewildering blur of interviews and meetings, the pressure and expectations of our investors and our publisher, the stuffy, sterile confines of the convention, of civilization itself in all its guises, all gradually parlayed into a half-remembered dream, as I awoke to the magnificent majesty of the timeless mountain range around me. The feeling struck me in its similarity to exiting a video game, only to find oneself snapped back into the stark reality of solid matter. A world of uncertainty and consequence, cut free of the trammels of the curated experience. We set up camp before dusk. It had been a balmy autumnal day, but was cooler at this elevated altitude, and the temperature descended further with the setting of the sun. We found an exposed bluff, not too close to the tree line, with a magnificent view. We collected brushwood, and Ludwig, our dauntless dev director, got a nice bonfire going. As I sat down with a beer to enjoy the view, the aroma of grilling meat on the barbecue was beginning to intrude on the perennial scent of the pine trees. "So, what happened to Sven and George this year?" I said, surprised at the absence of these regulars. I prodded at the fire with a dry stick, sending a sprinkling of sparks riding up amid the smoke. "I saw them briefly in Vancouver. I assumed they'd be joining us." "They've got kids now, dude." Ludwig smiled, taking his seat in the circle with a grunt of relief. "Playtime is over for those boys. It's daddy mode for them for the next couple of decades." There was a smattering of broken laughter from the group. Lee Him cut in. "It'll be my turn next," he grinned. Our recruitment manager had recently got engaged. None of us had met her yet, and he brought up a photo from the gallery on his iPhone, showing it off to those present. "The love of my life," he declared proudly. "We're gonna have a whole mess of little hymns, if I get my way." "And some little hers too, perhaps?" Ludwig winked. Lee smiled. "She's a lucky girl," said Ludwig, appreciatively, never one to miss the opportunity to commend one of his team members. Lee shook his head. "I'm the lucky one, bro. She's something else." "Good for you, mate," I interjected, a little dismissively. "It will be your turn soon enough," the big Swede smiled wryly through his thick beard, a wicked glint in his eye directed at me across the campfire. I laughed. "Not me, dude. No woman's gonna tie me down. I'm a solo player. I do as I please. I'll leave it to the other people to breed. Besides, humans aren't rare. The race will struggle on somehow without my contribution." I grinned in my conceit, pleased with my curt dismissal. Ludwig grunted. "You'll see. One day you will meet her, and it will be different." He winked, handing me a bottle of beer and another to Dan, who was sitting beside him, before cracking the top of his own with a contemplative expression on his bearded face. In silence, we watched the lowering sun kiss the tops of the snow-capped mountains at the far horizon. At its touch, a wash of crimson spilled across the vast forested valley that lay spread across all those intervening miles. The Swedish dev director cleared his throat. "Here we are, boys, lost in the wilderness, in the thick of God's own creation. As proud as I am, as we all are, of our little game, as good as Creature Catcher is, as much of an achievement as it has been realizing our dream over those long weeks and months of work. This puts it all back into perspective, eh?" Dan clinked bottlenecks with the Swede. "Stop it, mate. You'll have the lads in tears at the sheer grandeur of God's creation if you're not careful." A wry grin splitting his lean features. "Nah, seriously though, you're right. It is a pretty epic venue for the after-show party, and I couldn't think of anyone I'd rather share it with than you mofos. Well, except maybe Tiffany from accounts." He offered a devious smile to the group. The comment drew a gust of hearty laughter from the majority of those gathered, while others nodded quietly in considered approval. Marty was a skinny, bookish engineer and bona fide genius who'd masterminded the game's core architecture. He was cleaning his glasses carefully on the hem of his shirt. When he spoke, his English was delivered in a clipped German accent. Dan, this little adventure was your brainchild. Tell me, what precisely are we doing out here in the back of bloody beyond? Marty had a habit of closing his eyes as he spoke, only opening them again when he'd completed his thought, as though he needed to harness his full concentration in order to slow his brain's computational rate down to the point where its processes might be communicated to regular humans. I mean, it is all most awe-inspiring, etc. But it's not, well, I'll be frank, I'm not used to roughing it to this degree. I mean, I've been in dire need of a poo-poo for the last hour, but... He paused to let the laughter die down. I have no idea where to go. He popped his glasses back on after meeting Dan's eyes. I mean to say, Dan, where are the facilities? There was another burst of laughter at this. Dan smiled. If we bump into the thing we've come here to find, it'll be all you can do to stop shitting your pants, son. Of that I can assure you. Explain? Demanded Marty seriously, adjusting his glasses and leaning forward. Dan lit the fat blunt he'd been rolling and took a long draw before speaking. When the words emerged, they were accompanied by a cascade of blue smoke and the heady musk of quality skunk. For a space, its pungency overpowered the succulent scent of grilling burgers and sausages on the barbecue. Well, we made a video game about tracking and killing monsters, right? So I figured it would be cool if we found one ourselves, in real life, or at least tried to. The others were all leaning in now, intrigued, but unsure as to the veracity of Dan's statement. You are joking, of course, Marty said suspiciously. Dan passed the blunt to Vince, who was oblivious to the conversation, lost in the melodious envelope of his Bose earphones. Leaning toward Marty, his eyes wide, Dan whispered, No, mate, I am deadly serious. Marty sat back, bemused, his head swivelling quiverously to survey the dark, silent trunks at his back through thick lenses. You know what a conspiracy nut Dan is, I said flatly, patting the art director on the shoulder. He's mad for those cryptid podcasts and stuff. He'll buy anything, this one. I have no doubt he believes it, even if some of us think he's lost the plot. Thanks, mate, muttered Dan, smiling, gazing into the fire. How are those burgers coming along there, JP? Said Paul, changing the subject. The heavy-set QA manager was hungry, and the long hike up from where we'd parked the 4x4s had made him sweaty and irritable. Who do you think is here at the grill? They are perfection, of course, replied the French coder. Too good for you, in fact. But JP is feeling charitable tonight, so come and get. At the queue, Paul clambered to his feet with some effort and headed toward the barbecue. Dan couldn't resist a jibe. This is Red Leader. Look out, Porkins is making his run. Some might have considered the comment offensive. Dan had always had too much snark for his own good. But we were all friends, and the comment was taken in the spirit in which it was intended. Paul caught his eye, the bonfire light dancing in his eyes. He laughed. If we do run into that cryptid thing, Dan, you won't need to worry. There's not enough fat on you to fry an egg, you scrawny little bitch. There was a ripple of laughter at the retort that was swiftly cut short by an eerie and distant baying that was repeated after a lengthy pause, during which our eyes met across the dancing firelight in questioning concern. A shiver ran through me at the sound of it. Even Paul stopped chewing, an already half-eaten burger hanging limp and half forgotten in one hairy hand. It had come from far off, and it had sounded big. Very big. Marty was the first to speak. Yeah, what the flip was that? Monsters, growled Ludwig in purposefully melodramatic fashion. Marty smiled thinly. Yeah, haha, very funny. But you know, we all heard it. What exactly makes that kind of sound? There was a pause. each of us lost in thoughts and speculations, scanning one another's eyes for any hint of recognition. When Dan spoke, it was in the hushed tones of a conspirator. "With luck, that was the beast we've come here to find." "Oh, fantastic," muttered Marty. "Don't worry, son," said Dan, his eyes flashing. "I came fully armed." He rummaged noisily in his backpack for a space, while the rest of us waited in anticipation. When he returned out of the darkness, there was a large and complex-looking DSLR camera in his hand. "Gotta get some epic shots with this bad boy," he said wolfishly. There was another ripple of laughter at that, but Marty shook his head in tight-lipped concern. "So that's it, eh? We're all content to stick around," he shrugged. "And just go to sleep with whatever made that sound just wandering freely around us." Ludwig gripped his knee, staring seriously into his bespectacled eyes. "Thank you, Marty, for volunteering to keep watch." He sighed for emphasis. "Wake me up at 9 a.m. with breakfast and a hot cup of coffee." His bearded face cracked into a broad smile as he patted the scrawny engineer's knee in mock sympathy. Then, after a pause, he added in hushed tones, leaning in, "Don't worry, man. It was probably just a moose. Nothing to worry about, okay?" Marty nodded uncertainly, cautiously relieved at his friend's reassurance. Pondering further, he muttered, "Probably?" But no one was paying attention. The conversation continued in a similar vein as night fell and our world dwindled gradually to a little oasis of flickering light in the darkness cast by a crackling campfire. Overhead, the vast, dark bowl of the firmament was punctured by a million tiny points of light, the tattered band of the Milky Way stretching from edge to edge, static and eternal, unchanged in the millions of years that had passed since humanity first walked erect on the earth. Torn from a dreamless slumber, I was thrust into a panic-stricken wakefulness by a shocking vocalization. Part animalistic roar, part shamanic shout it was, and its originator was close. Hastily, I sought its source, my eyes squinting, blinking in the early dawn light, as that cryptic cry echoed eerily from the tree line. Then it appeared, a great fur-clad shape looming above me, silhouetted against the grey of dawn. It gazed at me for a space, two tiny points gleaming in shadow. Then again it gave vent to that hideous cry. Only this time, at the height of its ferocity, it dissolved into a burst of raucous laughter. I was left dumbstruck and confused. Lee Him appeared abruptly at my shoulder. "Who the fuck is this guy?" I shrugged. "Good morning, gentlemen." The voice was deep and husky, the weathered voice of a mountain man, with a hint of an accent that might have been some strain of Scandinavian. "Welcome to my backyard." He gestured vaguely to the forest and mountains beyond. "Are you ready for a little adventure?" Dan, with a broad grin, said, "Peter, glad you could make it, mate," shaking the big wild man's hand warmly. "It's great to finally meet you." Turning to the group, Dan announced, Lads, this is Peter. He's going to be our guide. He knows these woods like the back of his hand, and he's the world's leading, if not only, authority on the thing we've come to find." Climbing to my feet, I shook the newcomer's hand tentatively, my nerves still jangling, the post-adrenaline shivers kicking in. "Pleased to meet you, I think." I forced a smile. "Dan, you never mentioned you'd be bringing a +1, Ludwig said gruffly. Dan laughed, but Peter looked serious. "What is this +1? It's like a date," said Dan. "He's joking." Peter eyed Ludwig. "Like with a girl?" He frowned questioningly at Dan, who nodded, embarrassed. "Ah, I see. Most amusing," said Peter in low tones. "Well, we will all be in for a date with the Husker." His eyes sparkled enigmatically from the shadows beneath those bushy brows as his gaze swept the group, a gaze that terminated with Ludwig and lingered. Paul appeared at my shoulder, leaning in as he spoke in hushed tones. "Who's this guy?" "A friend of Dan's. He's going to be our guide." Paul eyed the newcomer as he took a bite from a chocolate bar. What do we need a guide for? This trip was meant to be just us boys, you know. I nodded. He's trouble, Paul said, with a knowing leer. Is that an official bug report? The QA manager smiled thinly, pointing a pudgy index finger at me for emphasis. I'm telling you, there's something iffy about this one. We broke camp late, hiking a worn trail into the valley below the bluff. The morning was fresh and clear, the bright sky an unbroken metallic blue to the horizon, and the clean scent of the pines that rode on the gentle mountain breeze helped, in conjunction with a hearty breakfast of bacon, beans and black coffee, to take the edge off my hangover. An hour or so later found us on a narrow deer trail heading deep into the woods, following the route our new guide had mapped out for us, a route which, according to Dan, would take in several significant points of interest. Come on then, Dan, I said, pausing for him to catch up. What's the story with this thing we're meant to be looking for? I know you're into your paranormal stuff, but you don't actually think it's real, do you? Dan glanced briefly back up the trail, then answered. I'd seen some videos online, you know, mostly amateur stuff, nothing conclusive, just shaky footage, shot on camera phones, showing vague hints of movement in the trees, frightened and confused voices on the soundtrack. There was one fairly well put together documentary on YouTube too. That one was made by Peter. It was the one that swung it for me. I had to come and check it out, and it seemed like a great theme for our trip, he added enthusiastically. It seemed fitting, you know, in context, since we made a game about this exact subject, kind of. So what is it? I asked, non-committally. Some kind of Bigfoot? Like the one from that dodgy home movie from the 60s? The Patterson-Gimlin film? No, not exactly. This one is meant to be bigger. Bigger? Marty had been trailing behind us, listening quietly. Now he drew level, interrupting our conversation, his questioning eyes urging Dan to elaborate. You said this one is bigger? Oh, a lot bigger, said Dan, his eyes wide. I smiled wryly at that, but played along, convinced Dan was winding Marty up. But knowing how he loved the subject, I volunteered. Dan is convinced it's real. Dan cut in. You know, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that at one time there was a subspecies of giant humans. More than one, in fact. He was gesticulating enthusiastically, and I got the first inkling that for him there was more to this than simply an elaborate prank. I sighed nonplussed at his credulity. Dan, how could a race of giant humanoids remain undiscovered all this time? The Canadian wilderness is a vast region, sure, but in an era of Google Earth with satellite imaging and such, how could they stay hidden? To me, at that time, the whole idea seemed incredulous. Dan retorted, New species are discovered all the time. I cut him off. Sure, small stuff, beetles and insects, not huge whopping great monsters. There is evidence, he retorted. Ancient cultures across the globe all share similar tales of giants. It's something of a ubiquitous theme across many traditions, and we have physical evidence that corroborates the legendary, though the authenticity of the skeletal remains unearthed in Asia and South America is, of course, disputed by academia. We passed JP, just off the trail, cutting wood ears from the trunk of a tall pine, his sling bag brimming with fresh-cut fungi, wood ears and chanterelles. He was oblivious to our passing, lost for the moment in his own culinary pursuits. But this was thousands of years ago, Marty interjected. If they existed at all, surely none could have survived through to this modern era without discovery. You might be right, of course, sighed Dan. He levelled his eyes on us then, and the look carried an uncharacteristic degree of sincerity that, for the moment, gave me pause. That is why we're here, to find out. After a silent pause, I shrugged. I'll believe it when I see it. Come on, be honest, Dan, Harry interjected. He had paused to allow us to catch up. The chances of finding some undiscovered, primitive, subhuman creature out here are absolutely zero, right? You do know that. Harry regarded the art director with scorn. Dan shrugged. I just thought it'd be more interesting, thematically, than just holding up at some lame tourist campsite and getting pissed. Peter, who had been out in front leading the party, now halted beside the trail, waiting patiently for us to catch up. It is real, he said matter-of-factly. I have seen it. More than once. Here in this valley, 2 years ago, with another party such as yours. He paused to gaze off into the distance, his beard twitching. Ari rolled his eyes. I turned my attention to the path ahead, where it wound down through a rocky defile, twisting out of sight beneath an arcade of overhanging boughs. You too will see it, God willing. Then, he looked back at us, and his eyes caught mine in a hard stare. Then, you will believe. As the wilderness swallowed up our little band of friends, the sheer immensity of the mountain country began gradually to dawn upon me, to insinuate itself upon my psyche. My previous confidence in humanity's capacity for survey, my bluff assertion that every inch of our domain had been described and catalogued, began to seem naive and ill-considered. The meandering trail led us, mile by mile, deeper into a wild, forgotten country. Out there in the midst of that vast wilderness, it did not now seem nearly so improbable that some hitherto undiscovered and exotic proto-human species might survive and thrive in isolation, concealed by the inaccessibility and remoteness of their forested mountain home from the prying eyes of man. 1 billion years before, this mountainous region had been chiseled into a tortured confusion of serrated ridges and plunging deeps by the callous hands of an angry god. The long ages since that bygone epoch had not mellowed them, their savage beauty remaining, dark and unsullied, only partially veiled beneath the green mantle of pines, whose darkly verdant fronds yet concealed ancient secrets. It was gorgeous beneath their boughs. The air was still and cool, and a soft blue shade lent it an air of ageless serenity, its dreamlike ambience here and there theatrically interrupted by a dazzling pillar of unfiltered sunlight that, one might imagine, marked the spot where untold treasures might yet be unearthed. Despite its lulling quietude and pristine beauty, this was a wild place, the wildest, most remote place I'd ever experienced, and I began to sense via some primordial inkling that the forest around me whispered a warning. It was the merest suggestion of something sinister, carried on the breeze, a hint that kindled some latent sense of self-preservation in a mind long domesticated and steeped in the normalcy bias of urban life, anesthetized by the predictable security of a civilized existence. I suspect we all felt it, to varying degrees, but none broached the subject, each keeping to himself the dim suspicions that smouldered at the edge of his reason. No doubt they were foolish thoughts, engendered by the remoteness and unfamiliarity of our wild surroundings, and exacerbated by the puzzling cry we'd heard that night before, that yet lingered as an unsettling memory. We'd been hiking deeper into the wilderness for much of the day. In 2 places, Peter called the party to a brief halt to point out to us locations where he had encountered the Husker, as he called it, on previous expeditions. On his initial encounter, a decade past, it had been moving along a ridgeline some 2 miles distant, and he had had the privilege of observing its progress for several minutes, before it moved out of sight around a bluff. On the second occasion, he had been hiking alone, and had pitched camp along the shore of one of the small tree-lined lakes that punctuate the high mountain country. He had stumbled upon the creature drinking from the lake, as he had returned to his camp from foraging, and had, so he claimed, been fortunate to avoid detection. He was of the opinion that the creature would prefer, given the choice, to avoid direct human contact, but that, if taken unawares, it could prove to be an extremely dangerous adversary. His tales were met with a high degree of good-humoured skepticism from much of the group. Dan, though, was rapt at our guide's descriptions, and Marty stuck close to the pair, seemingly eager to glean as many details as possible from the mountain man's first-hand accounts. Throughout the day's hike, we had adopted a fairly leisurely pace, the terrain, as it was, being unforgiving in its undulating convolutions. For a group of typically sedentary, desk-bound nerds like us, the going had been arduous. I was footsore and hungry, and inclined to suggest we find a good spot for that night's camp, when my speculative train of thought was derailed by a shout from the front of the line. The voice was cracked with an edge of dismay. Hey, you guys!" The anxious intonation continued, and a white face appeared among the brush, looking back with an expression of shock. There's something here. Someone's here. Glancing at one another, we hurried forward en masse, curious and concerned, but stopped in our tracks at what we found. A tight knot of men, each individually mentally digesting the tableau that confronted us. It was clearly a body dressed in filthy hiking gear, laying prone amid the low ferns and leaf litter. There was something disconcerting about the anatomy, something peculiar and unsettling about the pose. A man ought not to look like that, and no living man could. He, whoever he was, had been torn in two, separated at the waist, the hips parted from the torso to reveal a glimpse of pale, segmented lumbar curve, visible against the backdrop of dark corruption. Dan stood behind the body, looking back at us, his face a mask of stunned apprehension. Peter broke from the group, planting one knee beside the corpse, examining it dispassionately. "This one has been here for some time," he advised, shaking his head, and I heard him muttering to himself, "Such a waste." Harry ventured a question. How might a guy come to be divided in this manner? Dan interjected. "A bear, most likely." "Or one of them cryptid things," smirked Paul, unperturbed, munching contentedly on a chocolate bar. Peter smiled thinly. "What is that stink?" muttered JP. "So, what are we going to do about this shit then?" asked Paul, his mouth full of chocolate. "We can't just leave this here," said Ludwig. There was a murmur of discussion among the party. "We should call the cops," ventured Lee. "Yeah, or mountain rescue or whatever," suggested Paul. Dan looked dubious. Peter stood up, a grin spreading beneath his beard. "Call the cops," he scoffed. "Sure, why don't you use your iPhone?" Still smiling, he sat down on a flat rock and began filling a small, much-worn clay pipe from a leather tobacco pouch. Looking up, he added, with more than a hint of irony, "Why don't you order a pizza while you're at it?" Smiling at his own levity, Peter lit his pipe with a match, while the rest of us embarked on a heated debate as to what ought to be done. Taking a long pull on his pipe, Peter expelled a heavy broom of smoke as he spoke again. Our debate petered out in the wake of what he said. "There is no way to contact anyone, not out here. So deep in the wilderness. No, there will be no calling of the cops, as you suggest," he mocked. We looked at one another. That vague sense of isolation, lost in an all-encompassing vastness that we had all sensed earlier in the day, had suddenly become concrete. "We must hike back out and inform the authorities," said Marty. It was Peter's turn to look dubious. "And so, I ask you gentlemen, what is the rush?" The big fur-clad guide returned to the body, kneeling and lifting a torn flap of raincoat to peer within. "Our friend has lain here for quite some time, by the looks of him," he said solemnly. Then suddenly brightening, "A few more days will do him no harm." He raised one hand to quell the mounting objections. "We will take careful note of GPS coordinates. We cover body and mark spot for identification, and we report our find at the first ranger station we come across on our hike out." He shrugged, puffing on his pipe as he surveyed us with a measured eye. "Peter has seen many such cases. It is simple as this." Peter was as good as his word, and once the grim task was complete, the party continued on, with myself bringing up the rear. Before losing sight of the place where we'd found the body, I glanced back and I found myself wondering how that man had met his end, and just what could have left him in such a shocking state of dismemberment. We pitched camp an hour later, in a broad, boulder-strewn clearing above the valley, after a fairly arduous ascent that was passed largely in silence, each man lost in his own private contemplation of our grim discovery and its implications. After the tents were erected and sufficient brushwood had been gathered, the bonfire was lit. I sat beside it, coaxing it with judicial prodding and the measured application of additional sticks of appropriate size and frequency to forge a respectable blaze. As ever, JP had his own fire going beneath the portable barbecue that formed the most indispensable component in his kit. Soon the compelling aroma of grilled meat would intimate itself into the camp, and I awaited its imminent arrival with eager anticipation after a long and eventful day. Peter had vanished for the time being, and the others were busy with one thing or another, so that I found myself alone by the fire when Dan abruptly appeared at my elbow. I've got something I'd like you to take a look at," he said, somewhat conspiratorially, and I watched with interest as he retrieved a battered SLR camera from his rucksack. "I found this beside the body," he confided. "No one else knows about it." I frowned. "Why the subterfuge, Dan?" He ignored the question and went on. "I put some fresh batteries in it. Just you take a look at that last video on the memory card." He hit the play button and handed me the camera. I took it, thumbing a smear of dirt from the small screen at its back to improve the view. The content of the video was, at first, difficult to appreciate, a blurred mess wiped back and forth across the tiny screen in rhythm, accompanied by the tiny reproduction of wind noise and the swish of fabric sliding over fabric. "Turn the volume down," urged Dan, glancing over his shoulder. Then the image coalesced into a shaky view of some treetops with a grey, overcast sky above. The view shifted to reveal a stretch of rocky ground with a dense tree line beyond the bluff. I glanced at Dan. "What is this?" I said, nonplussed. "Just watch," he said flatly. I returned my attention to the little screen. Something was moving between the tree line and the bluff, something large and indistinct. A huge humped shape, rising. Then there were eyes, small, bright pinpoints, deep set in the great bulk. The view once again became a blur of movement, and over the camera's little speaker I could hear the desperate intonations of a man in terror of his life. There was a brief glimpse of the sky and a dark shape shifting across it. Then the dark shape had eyes. Then the screen went blank. I continued to watch the blank screen for several seconds as I digested what I'd seen. "What do you think of that, then?" Dan probed. I didn't know what to think, and I said as much. "Looks pretty real to me," said Dan. "I'd say our friend lying back there on the trail bumped into something, the kind of something we're out here looking for." "It could all be a prank." I looked at him hard. "This is just the sort of trick you'd play, isn't it, Dan?" He sat back on his heels and ran a palm through his cropped hair. "I'll admit, this would be extreme even for you, but..." Dan cut me off. "This ain't no prank, mate. This is real. Do you think I could fake a dead body that's been torn in half? I mean, I'm flattered, but that is way out of my league, mate." I had to assent to that. Dan gazed into the fire. "Should we tell the others?" "Tell the others what?" said Ludwig brashly, crouching beside Dan and proffering him a silver flask of bourbon. Dan met my eyes with a question. Peter appeared silently out of the darkness. "The boss is feeling a bit off colour. He has a bit of a bellyache, if I understand correctly." I glanced at him, startled. Peter continued, patting my shoulder with a heavy hand. "I'm certain he will be, as you say, right as rain by morning." Ludwig sniffed. "Take some bourbon. It will settle your stomach, and it might finally put some hairs on your chest." He grinned good-humouredly. I gripped the proffered flask and took a pull. It helped. Peter remained by the fire in contemplative silence all through dinner, as the others joined and ate and left to bed down for the night. Dan and I did not return to the subject of the footage we'd seen on that recovered camera for the remainder of the evening. After dinner, I retreated and bivouacked in my tent. I spent a fitful night of restless listening, lost in a fever of fretful anticipation, expecting every moment the arrival, at our little encampment, of the vague, horrible thing half glimpsed on the video, made monstrously real. The next day we broke camp early, and, under Peter's guidance, headed for a certain infamous location, which the creature had been known to frequent, having been spotted in the vicinity by several adventurous hiking parties during the course of the last half-century. The day passed more or less uneventfully, aside from one marked incident that finally threw into sharp relief the precariousness of our position for all the party. Late in the afternoon, Peter, who had taken the lead, abruptly called us to a halt. His blue eyes were intense with awestruck enthusiasm as he spoke to the gathered group in hushed tones. "Look, here, that's the Husker's spore." He pointed to a muddy patch of pine-shaded clearing. "What the hell is spore?" Vince scowled, slipping his earphones aside, momentarily dipping out of his soundscape to investigate the outside world for a space. Dan nudged his elbow. "Tracks, mate. Footprints." Vince nodded sagely. Satisfied, he withdrew once again into his self-imposed, rhythmical cocoon. Peter scampered forward with surprising agility for a man of his stature. "And here, leading off this way." He glanced up at us, his eyes dancing. "Oh, we are lucky, my friends. These tracks, they're fresh. Perhaps only 1 hour old." There was an uneasy murmur from the knot of onlookers. "That footprint is fucking massive!" blurted Paul, spitting crumbs from the cereal bar he'd been munching. Peter grinned, nodding energetically. "I know. Isn't it remarkable?" "It's most likely a fake," offered Harry. "No way that shit's real." Peter stood up slowly, lifting his chin. He took a step toward Harry. "Oh, it's very real, my friend. You can be sure of that." Harry sniffed, breaking eye contact. Ludwig spoke. "Assuming it is real, it is remarkable, no doubt. But I think I speak for the group when I express a degree of concern for our personal safety." I sensed a subtle but unequivocal shift in the mood of the group, like the strains of a song suddenly dropping into a minor key. "Gentlemen," smiled the guide, his bare paw-sized hands held out, palms upward, beseeching them. "Do you think Piotr would chaperone a clutch of tourists into Husker territory without ample protection?" The big guide threw open one side of his fur-fringed coat, theatrically revealing the sawn-off elephant gun hanging from a strap in his left armpit. "If the Husker gets frisky, well, Betsy will have something to say about it, eh?" His smile broadened. A couple of the lads nodded appreciatively. The rest seemed less convinced. The gun was a formidable weapon, a Nitro Express .577, unless I was mistaken. And I wasn't mistaken. I knew that weapon well enough. Because we had included it in our game. Only ours was a full-length rifle. Chopping one down like that, it was almost a crime in itself. This was a valuable antique, a rare treasure from the latter days of the Old West, not some pawn shop Saturday night special. Dan said, "Look, Peter, I just want to get a decent photo of the thing if I can. I don't want to kill it." "Just so," Peter agreed solemnly. Marty cut in, and when he spoke, the quiver in his voice betrayed his barely contained anxiety. "Far be it from me to wish to encroach upon your photographic ambitions, Dan. But I suspect I speak for at least some of us here in the group when I say we need to get the fuck out of here right now." Peter clicked his tongue. "A noble thought, sir. Sadly, it will be dark in an hour. If self-preservation is at the forefront of your mind, trying to hike out of here at night in the pitch black, this might prove to be unwise." Marty bristled, but the cold logic of Peter's argument was unavoidable. "So what then? Wait here to be eaten alive?" "Not that," smiled Peter. "Come with me. I know a good location for camping nearby." At sunset, we pitched camp once more, on a raised shelf of land on the south side overlooking the valley, a low, tree-studded cliff climbing sheer at our backs, the leaden mood of the group growing ever darker with the onset of night. A fire was lit and tents pitched, this time in a close-knit huddle closer to the fire, As ever, JP got his barbecue going, and the subsequent enticing aroma of cooking meat did much to temper the sullen atmosphere around the camp. Peter had wandered off, but reappeared as the group began to gather around the campfire in anticipation of dinner. "In morning, we see," announced Peter. "See then if we think we have all had enough of the mountains. If so, then we will hike out. Just a couple of days' march back to the cocktails and the pussies and the motorcars and the video games, yes?" His smile melted as an afterthought struck him, and he wagged a thick index finger as he continued. "On second thought, perhaps not so much pussies for you nerds, eh?" He elbowed Marty good-humouredly, almost knocking him to the ground. "Fuck you, Peter," said Dan grimly. "Oh, Dan, it's just Peter's little joke. Don't tell me you two are shitting your pants." "Not exactly, mate, but it's a bit fucking much, all this." Peter looked at him deadpan. "You said you wanted wilderness adventure, said you wanted to meet a monster." He shrugged, gesturing vaguely. "Well, here you are." The big guide moved off, addressing the group as a whole. "Listen, no lights tonight, guys, okay? No headlights, no light in tent, nothing. The fire, it is okay, but nothing else. We don't want to attract anything to the camp. Just a precaution, okay?" He smiled lightly, but it wasn't convincing. There was a silent, contemplative pause after that last comment. I just gazed into the fire, preoccupied with a memory of the curious footprint we'd seen earlier in the day, and by the image of that torn body we'd stumbled across. Paul was grumbling, and raised his voice, calling, "Hey, JP, how's that food coming along? We're all bloody starving over here, mate." We waited for a reply, but nothing was forthcoming. No caustic yet good-humoured insult delivered in that faded French accent. Just silence, permeated by the mute crackling of frying meat. "I don't know how you think about food right now," said Lee. "What the heck is that smell?" Shaken from my introspection, I stood slowly, eyes sweeping the camp. The little folded-out barbecue squatting below the cliff some 10 yards distant, a little fire flickering beneath it. But where was JP? The last vestiges of dusk were dwindling in the west as I strode across the sward. Overhead the stars were out, a million pinpoints of brightness, spattered across the violet bowl of the firmament in a gorgeous display. Like so many eyes, they looked on, unblinking in their permanence, as they had for 1 billion years, as they would for 1 billion more, oblivious and impassive to the small doings of man. Dan followed me. "JP," I called, and Dan echoed me, while the others stirred, silhouetted by the campfire. "Where the fuck is he?" I muttered. "JP, you'd better not be pissing about, mate," snarled Dan. I looked at him, and caught the gleam of worried eyes in the dark. "I rather hope he is," I said, but my hopes were to prove futile. There was no sign of JP around the camp, and our continued calling returned no reply. Then, after some fruitless searching, one remnant was discovered. A torn cook's bag, lying forlorn and abandoned a few yards from the dying embers of the barbecue, surrounded by a scattering of carefully wrapped herbs, butter, bottles of olive oil and balsamic. Other than this small token, there was no sign of the Frenchman, no hint to indicate what had happened to our friend. The group gathered around the fire, huddled close against the vast darkness of the night in the wilderness, in much the same way as our ancestors had done for countless centuries before the dawn of civilization, in an epoch where we were the hunters of, but also often fell prey to, the savage beasts that shared our domain. "What the fuck is this, Peter?" I said sourly. "You bring us out here, into the middle of nowhere. First we find a dead body. Now one of our team is missing. This was meant to be a vacation. What the fuck is this?" Peter remained silent, gazing into the fire. I glared at him, waiting for a reply. "You know something, don't you?" I stammered. We don't know anything for certain. Let's not go hurling rash accusations, said Ludwig evenly. JP might have wandered off for a piss and got lost or something. He trailed off, lost in doubt. This is too much, said Marty. We ought to have gone back when we discovered the body, he chided. Then came the footprint and now JP is gone, he continued, his voice rising. Tell me, Dan, have you... Lee cut him off. Let's not jump to any conclusions, Ludwig cut in. There's nothing to be gained by fighting among ourselves right now. We are a team, said Lee in low tones. Let's start acting like one. Actually, there is something more, offered Dan sheepishly. I found this. He produced the battered DSLR camera. I found it beside the body. What of it? Inquired Ludwig, bushy eyebrows raised expectantly. There's a film on it, Dan stammered, his voice uncharacteristically broken by a swelling sense of remorse. It's shaky and blurry as hell, but there's a thing on it, I explained. A thing? Said Marty, polishing his glasses in open agitation. Wait, said Ludwig, touching my sleeve. You knew about this? We didn't want to cause any unnecessary alarm. Marty jammed his glasses back into position. It seems like this information, it was pretty fucking necessary to me. What's happening with dinner? Said Vince, slipping those fat headphones down to hang around his neck. A man is dying of hunger right here. We all looked at one another, nonplussed. Who's going to tell him? Muttered Paul. Tell me what? Said Vince, his eyes moving quizzically from one to the next. Ludwig leaned forward. JP is missing. Yeah, Dan has a video of the monster, chafed Marty in a caustic aside. Vince looked bemused. Well, can't anyone else here cook food? Dan touched his shoulder. JP's gone, mate. Do you understand? Vince sat for a while, silently digesting the news. Finally he spoke. But I'm still hungry, he shrugged. Well, you can fucking go and cook then, can't you? Snarled Paul, leaning toward him, his eyes blazing. Just try not to get eaten by a dirty great monster. Silence lingered long around the campfire after that, each man immersed in his own thoughts, each locked in a silent struggle to keep his head above the surface of a sea of fear and doubt and incredulity. I don't think anyone slept that night. We all sat up, ringed around the campfire, much as our distant ancestors had done 100,000 years before, carefully feeding the flame to keep it alive, our beacon of light and hope, against the all-encompassing void of night, alive with preternatural predators. We passed the time in a brooding silence, sporadically punctuated by grave speculations, or bitter recriminations muttered in low tones. The dawn broke, weak and sickly, through a heavy fog, the pale disk of the sun turning a milky blind eye to the plight of our hapless little company. Nothing moved in the grey stillness, and a vivid silence persisted, broken only by the prosaic sounds of human activity as we hastily struck camp. Peter stood, watching the dawn, a dark silhouette against the grey. Beyond him, in the distance, the rocky pine-studded bluff that formed the opposite side of the valley had been reduced to a simple cutout of grey on grey, half lost in the mist. On impulse, I moved to join him. After a while, he spoke. They took another of your fellows during the night. What? I said. He said nothing, instead solemnly handing me a pair of dirty, battered earphones. I broke from him. Vince! I shouted across the camp. Vince, where are you, mate? I moved between the tents, calling his name, the focal point of half a dozen bemused, frightened faces that rose to regard me, interrupted at their labour by my sudden uproar. There followed a brief and fruitless search. Vince was missing. We need to get the fuck out of here right now, guys, stammered Marty, suddenly appearing, wide-eyed at my elbow, before we all go missing. What about Vince? What about JP? Said Ludwig. We can't just abandon them. Marty fumbled his glasses, putting them on. Well, I suppose we could linger to debate the morality of the choices before us. Or we could just get the fuck out and grapple with our existential guilt later. So, just leave our friends behind? Look, said Marty, if you want to make me the scapegoat, go ahead. I'm just voicing what each of us is privately thinking. But we can't just leave them, said Paul pleadingly. Yeah, insisted Lee. They can't have gone far. We should try to find... Wait. Marty surveyed the gathering. Listen, guys, we must be logical. Just ask yourself, would Vince and JP just wander away from camp for no reason? Is that smell again? Muttered Lee absent-mindedly. We looked from one to another, and no one spoke. Marty snatched the earphones from me, waving them for emphasis as he snarled. Did you ever see Vince go anywhere without these bloody things? There was a murmur of guarded assent. You want to stick around and maybe get picked off next by these fucking monsters? He shrugged. For me, this is not the performance solution to the problem at hand. A long moment of contemplative silence was broken by a distant and dreadful howling. A deep, guttural, staccato intonation it was, that echoed across the gorge, lingering eerily in the vast stillness. Nobody moved. It was answered a moment later by a second vocalization, this time much nearer, a rumbling bellow like the grumbling idle of some great animalistic engine. That sound reached into me, triggering the long-dormant hereditary fight-or-flight response, evolved and refined as it had been in the dark epoch before the fire of consciousness was lit in the dim minds of the first men. A jet of hot adrenaline shot through my chest cavity, firing my tired body to renewed vigour, brightening my mind and my senses to sharp, clear-cut, vivid lucidity. Peter turned to face the group, a savage smile on his wild, bearded face. "The Husker!" he exclaimed. "No shit!" nodded Paul. "We must make for higher ground," urged Peter, indicating a steep path that wound through a narrow defile in the cliff to our rear. "Come with me." "If we want to live," Marty grunted sardonically. "Let's get the F out of H," snarled Harry. "This game is over." "Not yet, it's not," growled Ludwig, laying a thick palm on the other man's chest. "Let's move." Marty was frantically scrambling to pack up his tent, casting fitful glances over his shoulder to peer anxiously into the vastness of impenetrable fog. "Forget it," I advised him, touching his shoulder. "You'll go faster without it." Marty caught my sleeve, indicating Peter with a jut of his chin. "Are we just going to trust this guy?" He raised his eyebrows in question. "I mean, JP? Now Vince?" I studied the horizon for a moment, thinking. I don't see that we have any other option right now. Then we were moving, an ill-organized rabble fleeing the camp in disarray, leaving equipment and tents and God knows what else behind in our haste to evacuate, ahead of the approach of this hitherto unforeseen predator who, we were now convinced, had already taken the lives of 2 of our compatriots. Even as we quit the camp, it, or they, must have been on the move, canvassing our position in preparation to gorge a primordial appetite on the remainder of our party. For perhaps an hour we fled at a punishing pace, climbing up and out of the ravine, following the ridgeline that ran along its northern side, heading westward. The going was hard, on seldom frequented paths that were in many cases nothing more than deer trails. We moved in silence, save for heavy breathing as we toiled. Fear was in all our hearts then, our thoughts occupied with guilt and bewilderment at the turn of events that had brought us to this moment. What had been intended to be a well-deserved and relaxing retreat, after a long, hard grind to the finish of a big project, had been recast and was now a retreat of a very different kind, a desperate decampment and a headlong run for our lives. No more dire vocalizations were heard, for the time being, and within the hour we had slackened our pace more through fatigue than discretion. We did not rest, however. We were all too keyed up, all plagued by a malignant anxiety that drove us relentlessly onward, despite pain and exhaustion. We continued like this for the greater part of the day, stumbling westward along little-used paths and deer trails, led relentlessly onward by Peter, our darkly enigmatic guide. As the day wore on into the late afternoon, from somewhere behind us, out of the wild forest hills and valleys, the great bellowing call of the Husker was heard anew. That primordial utterance, reawakening in us, in sharp relief, the desperation of our predicament, and stirring us to renewed efforts despite our fatigue and the lateness of the day. Ever and again we heard it after that, echoing eerily through the desolate, hollow places where, perhaps, no human had, in all the history of man, ever set foot. Each time it came, it spurred us on to redouble our efforts, yet each time it came, it sounded closer than before. The camaraderie of the group had propelled us through difficult times, through long nights and weeks and months of hard, focused work, to ultimately achieve an outstanding success with our inaugural video game release. Now that bond was tested to breaking point. The line of us had gradually strung out as we fled, those younger and fitter members of the group breaking away at the front, while those who were older or out of shape fought a losing battle to stay with the group. Though we encouraged one another, the reality was becoming clear. It was every man for himself now, and those that couldn't keep pace began to lag behind. The dense mists that had characterized the dawn had gradually thinned out, burnt off by the steady passage of the sun, so that now the distant bluffs and the vast mountain range that marched northward to the lost horizon were clear-cut in the gorgeous golden rays of the late afternoon sunshine. Suddenly, a short, stifled scream was heard from the back of the line, followed by a low, guttural growl I could feel resonating in my bowels. I wheeled to look. Ludwig was just behind me, and I could see he was making a quick head count of the men. He turned to regard me, his eyes ablaze. "Paul is missing." My focus shifted beyond him. Paul, encumbered by his weight and enervated by a sedentary lifestyle, had been at the back of the group. Marty and the rest were scampering up the shallow decline, leaping over rocks and running headlong toward us in their haste to escape what loomed over the bluff at their backs. How to describe it? Only its upper half was visible to me at that point, above the margin of the level ground. A huge ape-like thing it was, a flat skull and thick jaw studded with savage teeth, surmounting a towering torso hung with muscular, hairy, elongated arms. It must have been 20 feet tall from what I could judge, perhaps a little more, and as it lumbered with sickening agility up out of the gorge, it was joined by a fellow of its genus, and then a third was seen to emerge from the low-lying mists that yet lingered in the valley below. "This way!" I yelled, my own terror at the sight of them evident in the crack of my voice. "Come on, move it!" Gripping Ludwig's shoulder, I made for a narrow fissure between two giant boulders, beyond which was a defile cut into the cliff. Here was a chance at safety, albeit temporary, but it was the best we could hope for, and we made for it at a pace. Following close on my heels, Ludwig paused at the entrance as I entered, beckoning in frenzied encouragement to the men. Ari was the first through the gap, exhausted but grateful for the refuge and the respite it might afford. Marty was next, hot on his heels, stumbling with fatigue and panic into the narrow opening and scrambling through. Lee dodged past Dan, running headlong toward us along the loose surface of shale. Dan had paused to look back and was unslinging his camera. He took a knee to steady himself as he composed a shot of the looming monstrosity that, even now, lumbered toward him, with appetite apparent in the gleam of its deep-set eyes, a flash of red streaking its fang-studded jaws. Lee burst between us in a gust of breathless relief, into the relative safety of the narrow ravine, while the rest of us watched, wide-eyed in silent horror, as the towering creature bore down on Dan. "Dan, come on!" screamed Ludwig. "What are you doing?" Exasperation edging the timbre of his frantic call. But Dan was oblivious, wholly focused as he was on his long-dreamt-of and magnificent subject. "It's them!" muttered Lee. "That smell! It's them, those things!" "Are they not magnificent?" said Peter, almost proudly. "Could you imagine how much one of those things would be worth?" Harry spoke dreamily, his thoughts half lost in speculation. "If you could capture one alive?" Peter glanced at him askance. Outside, the art director kept shooting, heedless almost to the last of the threat as his diabolical assailant moved in. Then, suddenly, as Ludwig screamed once more in impotent despair, Dan awoke abruptly to his shocking plight. But it was too late. As he wheeled and fled, he was caught up in a terrible claw and lifted effortlessly skyward as his precious camera tumbled from his grasp. "Oh my God," stammered Marty at the horrifying spectacle, adjusting his glasses. I will not, for the sake of our friend's memory, describe exactly what we witnessed just then. Suffice it to say that a dispute broke out between two of the creatures over their victim. A brutal and incisive fight ensued, a titanic brawl of inhuman proportions and shocking ferocity. It ended as abruptly as it had begun, with both participants gaining a degree of satisfaction at their mutual victim's mortal expense. And despite some superficial yet bloody wounds, both resumed the hunt together in apparent equanimity. Averting my eyes in horror, I found myself staring at Dan's discarded camera. It now held evidence, not to say concrete proof, that these things, that the creature known to legendary as the Husker, was real. It was sharply apparent, however, that any attempt to retrieve it would be tantamount to suicide, at least while these monsters remained at large in the vicinity. But we had more pressing problems than proving out our departed friend's pseudo-scientific hypothesis. Ludwig was standing just outside the narrow cleft between the boulders, having counted those of us that remained through the gap to comparative safety. He, though, negligent of his own well-being, was not so fortunate. There was an appalling gust of fetid odour, and a flicker of a shadow. Then the flash of a vast grey something past the opening of the cleft, and with it, Ludwig was snatched bodily away. He was ripped from the ground and carried up and away out of sight, doubtless to descend into the gaping maw of one or other of those monstrous things outside. There was no scream, and no further sight nor sign of the man I had known as a friend and colleague for a decade and more. "Where the fuck is Peter?" snarled Lee, his ferocity edged with fear. "Never too far, my friend," Peter said, his voice low as he appeared from between the rocks at our back. "Come, follow Peter," he muttered, and not waiting for a reply, he vanished in the direction from which he had lately come. We fled then, those of us that remained, following our inscrutable guide, fled headlong through the narrow, twisting chasm between the rocks. The seasonal floodwaters of countless millennia had carved out that winding cleft methodically, with excruciating slowness and care. Now, we hapless few tore through it at a frantic pace, grateful for its protection, even as we cursed it, rebounding off buttresses and promontories in our haste amid its meandering convolutions. We continued along that ravine for 20 minutes, or perhaps it was half an hour, ever and again turning in trepidation to survey the cobalt strip above the cliff, fearful eyes questing for the looming presence of our monstrous pursuers. The stink of the Husker never left us, so near were they in their pursuit of their prey. Then, without warning, a lingering, almost mournful call broke the silence. The unmistakable call of the Husker. It was answered distantly, and then, after a space, a third guttural rumble that seemed to shudder the very ground at my feet. I stumbled and fell, gazing upward with fear-stricken eyes. There was a strangling scream right at my back, and I whirled to witness a titan hand descending among us from above. Gnarled it was, thick-fingered and dusty grey, its back bristling with a mat of coarse hair. It probed blindly about the crevice within which we survivors were hid. All scrambled in hectic confusion to evade it, but Lee was touched and caught, those iron fingers grasping and closing about him in an unshakable vice-like grip. We locked eyes for a brief moment, his chest half crushed in the creature's powerful grasp. He spoke breathlessly. "Not so lucky this time, eh, boss?" Then, in a flash, he was hoisted up and out of sight, and all that remained of him was a thin spray of crimson on the rocks about us, and a high-pitched shriek as he was torn apart. We were all left in a stunned silence, for the moment too shocked and bemused by the sudden and heralded subtraction of yet another of our number to move or think. Ari was the first to recover his senses, scrambling wide-eyed to his feet and pushing past Peter, jamming his way bodily through a choked section of the pass, frantically gripping and dragging with every ounce of his upper-middle-class, gym-developed strength, a huge slab of rock across the opening behind him, blocking our path and trapping us in a cul-de-sac. Overhead, the vivid sky had hemorrhaged to a violet grey with the onset of dusk. "It's nothing personal, guys." Ari's voice was muffled, coming from beyond the barricade. "It's just a calculation, you know? One of us might get away, but together, they'll track us to the last. I hope you understand." We heard his boots crunching away on the loose gravel. I leapt to my feet and grasped the stone slab, heaving with all my strength. But it wouldn't budge. Marty joined me, but even our combined effort couldn't shift it an inch, wedged as it was between the shoulders of the narrow cleft. Our eyes met, each of us vexed and frightened. "Where's Peter?" asked Marty. I shrugged. In the furor, I'd not had chance to spare a thought for our absent guide. A sudden, strident, animalistic bellow shook the stones around us. I could feel it churn my guts, could feel the air pressure fronting my eardrums. A hot jet of adrenaline shot through my chest like an acidic bayonet, spurring me to a fever pitch of panic as I hunted frantically for some means of escape. There was a cleft in the rock, low down below the base of the sheer cliff. It would be, perhaps, large enough to allow us to burrow within. A shadow moved across us, accompanied by a foul reek. "This way," I whispered insistently as I dove for the opening. And Marty followed, scrambling into the low cleft beneath the sheer rock wall like frightened rabbits, like worms of the earth. We crawled then, Marty and I. Before the light utterly failed us, I could swear I heard faintly from somewhere outside in the dusk the distant, frantic screams of our treacherous CFO. What ensued was an interminable cave crawl into the pitchy darkness. A pitiful disk of dancing yellow illumination lit the way, projected by the small flashlight I'd carried in my pocket. It was all we had to divine our path, a tiny, abstract, shifting window on that subterranean underworld of blank, black alienage. At that time, our minds were numb, overwrought by what we'd witnessed, and by the loss of our friends, so that we scarcely noticed the passage of time. Those black, endless Hypogean tunnels wound ever downward. Ever and again we passed through gorgeous, phosphorescent grottos, where our shuffling footfalls echoed eerily over limpid pools. And more than once we found ourselves edging painstakingly along narrow ledges, above yawning chasms of bottomless black void. We crawled and clambered and scrambled our way ever downward. How long we toiled through the darkness, I'll never know. All I do know is that my paralyzed senses returned to me abruptly, and with shocking import, quickened by the insinuation of a hauntingly familiar stench. I touched Marty on the shoulder. He flinched violently, his face a mask of fear in the torchlight, as he wheeled to regard me. "Can you smell it?" I whispered. "We need to go back." As I turned, I sensed a sudden movement behind us in the darkness. It was Peter, materializing incontinently out of the gloom. "No, you will be staying right here," he snarled. "Where the fuck have you been?" I muttered in shock before glancing down to find him jamming the cold barrel of the sawn-off elephant gun into my guts. Our eyes met. "Move," he demanded. Nonplussed and reluctant, Marty and I stumbled forward into what, judging by the echo of our shuffling footsteps, must have been a vast space. Water poured in a steady stream from somewhere above, tumbling over a fall of rocks worn smooth by the long passage of time and the action of the running water into a broad pool that glimmered in the moonlight that filtered down into the great cavern from an opening overhead. As my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, I began to make out forms. The deeply unsettling forms of great creatures shifting in the dark, creatures of appetite, whetted and invigorated at our opportune appearance. The stink of the place was overpowering. The stench of vast, unwashed animal bodies commingled with the slaughterhouse feta of rotten bones, and the foul slush of countless dismembered carcasses, both animal and human. It was appalling. "Welcome," said Peter proudly, his eyes gleaming insanely in the dark, "to the lair of the Husker." With a brawny arm he thrust Marty stumbling forward. The German staggered, falling to his knees at the edge of the pool. I heard him moan then, plaintively in resignation, his mind dragged out over the final abyss of visceral horror, as bright eyes appeared out of the gloom, levelling their ravenous attention on him. "Hello, my beauties," smiled Peter. "I've brought you some more sweet treats." He paused to admire them, and even then, in that moment of extreme peril, some part of me stood dispassionate and aloof to the danger, unable to observe the genuine affection in which this monster of a man held these secret giant horrors from a bygone epoch. A great something loomed out of the blackness across the pool, burning eyes paralyzing the hapless German software engineer. Then abruptly another appeared beside it, thrusting the first aside with a gut-wrenching growl. A great claw appeared, swooping down, and Marty was snatched up and hurled bodily through the air. I saw him fleetingly, screaming and cartwheeling through that filtered patch of moonlight, and beyond it into the black void from whence an even greater claw unfolded, and caught his whirling body in mid-flight. A deeper, all-encompassing rumble shook the antediluvian foundations of the cavern, and as its echo died away, it was replaced by the distant crunching of bones. I pissed my pants. Whirling in panic, I struck Peter in the temple with a flailing elbow. He staggered, more in surprise than in hurt, but in that instant of distraction, I snatched the gun from his hand and turned it on him. "Fuck you, Peter," I snarled. I depressed the trigger, but nothing happened. Our panicked eyes met for a timeless instant. Then he was rushing at me as I fumbled for the safety catch. There was a flickering flash and a deafening blast as Betsy spoke. Through the smoke I saw Peter, prone on the cavern floor, staring wide-eyed, clawing at a dark, glistening cavity in his guts. I spat in hysterical disgust at him, and all that had befallen myself and my friends at his hands. Then, dropping the weapon from nerveless fingers, I fled, as around me the great beasts clambered heavily to their feet, amid a deafening, ear-rending cacophony of animalistic howls. Instinctively, I made for the waterfall, and I suppose it did much to mask both my scent and the sound of my progress as I carefully climbed, soaked to the skin, shaking with fear, and every instant expecting to be caught up by some monstrous claw and smashed to a pulp in the hot, gaping maw of one of those things, or else to lose my grip on the smooth, algae-slicked rocks and plummet down onto the jumble of unforgiving stones far below. Somehow I made it to the top, and scrambled out of the yawning cavern into the clean open air of a breaking dawn. For 2 days and nights I staggered through the wilderness, haunted by the hideous memory of that cavern, and by the loss of my friends, and by the distant howls of monstrous creatures out in the unplumbed vastness about me, and by the distant howls of monstrous creatures abroad in the unplumbed vastness about me. In the morning I put the rising sun to my back and ran in a loping dog trot, like a frightened animal, Later, I followed the setting sun westward. At night, I found what cover I could, beneath tree roots or an overhang of rock, and shivered in the dark, my mind blank, devoid of all thought, save for a dim intent to survive. On the third day, I stumbled onto an asphalt road, and I lay down in plain view, beneath the gorgeous blaze of the setting sun, too exhausted and overwrought to go on. What remains is a blur. I have a dim recollection of 2 or 3 cars slowing without stopping before the Bronco squealed to a halt beside me. The driver, made of sterner stuff than those who preceded him, dragged me into the bed of his truck and took me, bedraggled and filthy and out of my wits, to the nearest ranger station. From there, I was deposited at a small town hospital, somewhere east of Prince George. "You've had a hell of a time, Mr. Blake." The doctor's voice lacked the distinct twang of the Canadian nurses, of whose presence I'd been dimly aware over the days since my arrival. "Still, whatever you've been through, and I'm sure the sheriff will get to the bottom of that in due course, you're in safe hands." He smiled, distractedly checking his pager. "You rest easy now," he nodded. I reclined my head on the soft, clean pillow and closed my eyes. But an insidious pang of doubt gripped me, some frisson of fear nagging at my tired brain. A shiver ran through me, the herald of a dawning realization. My eyes flickered open, only to find stark blackness. A darkness suffused with a malign stench of decay that prickled at my nostrils. "Ah, you're awake, finally." Peter's voice held all the dark, sardonic qualities it had displayed at our last meeting. "I wanted you to be conscious and alert for the finale. You had this all planned from the outset, didn't you?" I said, struggling to sit up. "You betrayed Dan, betrayed all of us. He thought you were his friend." Peter mused. "This is real life, my friend. Nature. It is, how do you say, red in tooth and claw." He smiled fiercely, and it was not a smile of friendship. "You were all far too trusting," he went on. "You should have listened to the one called Marty. He was smart, that one. He understand the stakes." Peter shook his head. "In arrogance, you thought him a coward." He snorted with a sardonic amusement. "Your bravery and your inability to grasp with clarity your situation brought you to this." He gestured to the dank, stinking lair of the Husker clan around him. He scooped up a handful of grit from the cave floor, letting it trickle from his hand. "Here, in real world, errors of judgment have real-world consequences." He scratched his beard reflexively. "It's not like one of your little toy games. You see, you can't just, as you say, respawn and play again." Peter stood erect, Betsy swinging loosely from his bald right fist. Slowly he backed away, his eyes serious, his gaze levelled on the monstrous beasts pacing in the darkness beyond the shaft of moonlight. At the mouth of the cleft, Peter gave vent to a short, strident whistle, and the burning eyes of those creatures swiveled to regard me, eyes that glimmered with an unquenchable savage appetite for human flesh. "You've given me quite a bit of trouble," said Peter, a knowing smile spreading his beard, indicating for my attention a dark stain at his midriff. "But you were dead," I whispered. "Oh, not quite dead, little computer man." His grin broadened to show sharpened, pointed, animalistic teeth. He leaned in close to my face, and I recoiled at the fetid stench of his breath. "Not quite dead." "You've been through a lot," said the nurse heartily, "but you're not quite dead yet. We'll get you back on your feet in no time." She busied about the room, drawing open the curtains and fussing over details, tidying up before collecting and examining the notes that hung at the foot of my bed. "Where have you been, Mr. Blake?" She shook her head. "You were in a right old state when you were admitted. Like something out of a horror movie, she laughed. I've been here at the hospital for several days. At least I think I have. I dread the onset of sleep. Each time my head hits the pillow, I find myself back in the cavern with Peter and those things. I'm confused, lost. I don't know what is real anymore. Am I at the hospital, safe and sound? Or still in that damn cave, delirious with terror and dreaming of an impossible escape? Which is it? I cannot be certain. The one shred of logic to which I cling is this. If I hadn't found my way out, how could I possibly have shared my story?